Well, welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Thiessen. I'm a professor here in International Development and Global Studies, and I'm the co-director with some of my colleagues who are in the room, Margaret and Stephen, for the Gender, Peace and Development Research Network, which is part of the Center for International Policy. This is the second event that we've hosted this fall, and there are a number of events that are coming up. I will happily share that information with you. You can make notes of some really cool things coming. First of all, I want to welcome, there's 55 people registered in person and 199 people registered online. Thank you for joining us. This is extraordinary. I think we're very lucky to have such interest in this important topic. So I would like to first just introduce the panelists. I'm going to serve as discussant and ask some questions. I'm going to facilitate the questions from the audience, both online, what we can take, and also in the room. But I'm going to turn over the questions to Loretta Baydu. So Loretta is a PhD student here at the University of Ottawa, and she's also a researcher and a former gender programming officer in Ghana. And we are joined today by 5 panelists. So welcome to Eileen Alma, who's coming to us from Nova Scotia. Thank you so much for joining us online today, Eileen. Eileen is the executive director of the Coady Institute, located at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish. She's been with Coady since 2013, and she has previously held positions with the International Center for Women's Leadership at the Coady Institute, as well as working with the International Development Research Center. So she's had an extraordinary career and lots to bring to our conversations. We also are hoping Shaheen Anam is going to be able to join us. Not yet, but we're working on the technical end of that. Shaheen is in Bangladesh, and it's 1:30 in the morning for her. So if she's able to join us, it's going to be fantastic, and what a trooper. She's also a human rights activist, executive director of Manusher Jano Foundation, and has worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNDP, Development Program in Bangladesh, and is associated with the practice of governance and development. Just a little reminder for those who maybe know, or for those who haven't heard, small pitch, the School of International Development is hosting an event on Thursday this week. The executive director, Nancy Sala from FIAP, is going to be here, and he's going to be talking between 10 to 11:30 in this room. So you're all welcome. See what room allows, but we're also going to have this hybrid event online for those who come in person. So hopefully we'll get Shaheen to join, and then 3 wonderful people we have in person with us today. Immediately to my right is Rita. Rita Morvia is a co-manager at Interpares, who works on issues related to women's rights, feminist movement building and health, including sexual and reproductive rights, Canada, Africa, and Asia. Next to her is Sheila Rao. She's a socio-cultural anthropologist and international cooperation consultant who specializes in feminist analysis of organizations change, development policies, and food systems research. She also teaches on gender and other topics. She currently works with the Center for Indigenous Conservation and Development Alternatives, which is based at McGill University, and works closely with Sea Change as their gender advisor for their East Africa project, Rural Women Cultivating Change. Brianna Parent-Long, next to Sheila, is a policy and advocacy officer at Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, and candidate in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University. Her research and professional interests include Canadian foreign aid policy, global advancement of sexual and reproductive health and rights, feminist civil society movements, and the impact of anti-gender actors. And her dissertation examines how Canadian development NGOs have navigated the shifting foreign aid priorities alongside the growing influence of anti-gender movements. And this is our panel for today. The structure of our event is as follows. Brett is going to begin by asking questions. I'll pop in and ask questions too. Then we'll have time to hear from you in a Q&A session. And we'll turn back to the panel for the last 10 minutes of our evening, where they will each be able to respond to a number of questions that come from the audience. If you haven't had a chance, you're welcome to grab some coffee and water and snacks. I invite you to do that. But now join me in welcoming our panel today.
Rebecca, and thanks to everyone for being here. And thank you to in-person as well as online colleagues. So to get us started, I'd like to first thank to Eileen, since she's the only one online at the moment. Could you share with us some of the impacts you've seen as a result of Canada's FIAP in terms of localization strategies and the FIAP's contribution to supporting local women's organizations?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's really nice to see some friends and colleagues around the table, those that I can see. And I know there's probably a lot more behind the camera that I can't see. So thank you so much. And as Rebecca indicated, I'm the executive director of Coady Institute, based in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, and Rebecca said it correctly, Antigonish. You know, we're 2 hours away from Halifax, so we're really in a very in a rural setting. Although during COVID, I can say that a lot of people from Ontario moved here, so it's changing every day. Anyways, that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about FIAP. And let me begin by telling you that Coady Institute has a 98-year history. That's both globally for 65 years, as well as locally here in Atlantic Canada for the 98 years that I've mentioned. And the work that we've done has always been addressing what we say is citizen-led, asset-based, and community-driven development. The educational programming that we offer is very much focused on helping communities understand what they already have as assets, rather than going into communities to look for deficits. And that has been the premise of our work for all of that time. So when we talk about the FIAP, I was already inclined to think about how do we help communities build on what they have? How do we help them be decision makers and controllers over what development should be? Rather than us coming in, particularly us here in the global north, coming in to have a particular assumption in mind and of ways that things should be done or can be done, and immediately applying a deficit model. So the Feminist International Assistance Policy, when it was developed, and I know you've got one of the architects in the room, was welcome to us, and it wasn't necessarily new. It was about, and it always has been about, shifting power. And for us, it has allowed us to be even more concrete in trying to drive those agendas that ensure that all, you know, communities and all persons in those communities, in a very inclusive way, are really working at achieving the socioeconomic development that they're looking for. And moreover, going further to really focus in on advocating for the rights of those that have been systemically underrepresented or marginalized, including women and girls of all makes, but also thinking about it from an intersectional lens, to think about race, ability, identity, indigeneity, etc. So this for me was a natural extension of the work that we already do. At the same time, we, you know, having been in the development field for more than 30 years, you and I both, all of you probably know the ups and downs that we've had when we've looked at gender equality or gender transformative approaches. And it ebbs and flows, and has ebbed and flowed with changing leadership, with changing priorities, and indeed with individuals who are driving the agendas, which has resulted, I think, in a lot of sort of inequality amongst how organizations on the ground can best achieve gender equality. and really advocate for women and girls in particular. So I see that with FIAP, with Canada's leadership of the FIAP, we've been able to really place that lens front and center and give it the legitimacy and the respect actually that it deserves. It moved way further to ensure that it was to help ensure that gender equality and women's rights and the rights of those that are systemically underrepresented are actually taken up seriously and put front and center of development agendas. And by not only bringing the FIAP into place, but also putting the numbers around it in terms of the numbers of projects that they expected to have that focus, was welcome in Global Affairs Canada in terms of the work that they set out, or the goals that they set out. Now, when it comes to women's rights organizations, I think that many of you in the room can speak to what this has meant, particularly in terms of ensuring financial and human resources that go to the women's organizations that genuinely have the lowest amount of funding or the least amount of funding overall, and really help to lift them up. I will also, though, mention to you that in terms of the organizations that we've worked with at Coady, it's also equally important to think about the influence that the FIAP has had on organizations that may not only have women's rights in their agenda, even Coady itself. It's obviously women-led right now, but the focus is, comes in from many different themes and other lenses beyond it. And so it's important to note how much has happened to shift the conversation, even in organizations that have been very reluctant to even put full resources into gender transformation, let alone feminism, or let alone even talk about what feminism is. And I see that in many partners that we have that we're working with around the world now, as well as here in Canada. The ways in which the word feminism is becoming more understood, even if it has different sort of connotations or different interpretations, which is important also to really think carefully about. And it's not just a lip service anymore. So my sense is that I've seen a real shift away from a reluctance to even talk about the word feminism and gender transformation as well. And then finally, I'll say that it's helped to change a conversation and a movement away from just thinking about how do we lift women and girls out of poverty. And Lily Nichols, who I think is in the room, and I had this conversation just last week about how I like to think about not poverty reduction per se, but wealth creation for women and girls. And I think, Lily, you aptly put it as asset building. And I think that's also a really important way to describe it. It's about not just assuming that, sort of the bottom rung for women, but equality and achieving quality really requires us to ensure that they are elevated to the same level, if not more, in terms of ensuring their socioeconomic well-being. So for me, those are some of the main things that I've seen so far as a result of FIAP, and we can continue this, but I'll hand it off for another panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. So we'll just move into the room now. And maybe we'll start with Brianna and move on to Sheila and then Rita. So can you tell us a bit about the impact you've observed as a result of the FIAP in terms of what did the FIAP enable you to do in the work that you do? What did they enable you to do more or better? So Brianna?
I think the FIAP had played a really important role in norm and standard settings, and it did make gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights, what I refer to as SRHR, as explicit priorities, which we hadn't seen before. And we saw this more and more in funding calls, how they were structured, and how priorities were framed within Global Affairs Canada. But I think importantly, when we're talking about the FIAP, there are some deficits in the framework, but some of those were made up for in the financial. And so it was those financial commitments that kind of gave it operational life. So I think we see people pay, like initiatives that are announced that don't necessarily have the resources to back it up, but the FIAP did have funding behind the rhetoric. And for the Future Planning Initiative, which is 6 organizations in Canada that include Paras and Action Canada, there was able to be leveraged the FIAP framework to ring fence SRHR funding, and for what became the 10-year commitment that had an average of $1.4 billion allocated to global health initiatives and had 700 million specifically for SRHR annually. So this enabled long-term predictable resources for programming and advocacy that wasn't seen before, and explicitly targeted structural barriers in non-neglected areas of SRHR, which had been intentionally avoided by the Harper government. So topics like abortion shifted from too decisive about a topic to be putting in international assistance to it's being named as one of the government's 5 neglected areas to prioritize in 2019. So this began transforming gender norms instead of just pursuing equality. And then we saw the institutionalization and prioritization of women's rights that not only shaped practices inside Global Affairs Canada, there is an SRHR team, but it also influenced how partners saw Canada's role globally. So Canada has been recognized internationally, particularly in multilateral forums, for its consistent promotion of women's rights and SRHR. So this focus prompted many organizations to be able to actually strengthen gender and SRHR expertise by hiring dedicated specialists, because there was funding for that now, which helped improve analysis, program design, monitoring, evaluation, and the ability to kind of be watchdogs for the government. When there's an investment in advocacy, there's a better ability to hold them accountable. With this, there was greater investment, which was already mentioned by Eileen, in feminist movement building, which was super important because this is the connective glue that we need to sustain this organizing. So organizations that maybe were not able to secure funding in previous administrations because of their priorities were now getting funding and now able to invest it in building strong shifts and movements. And that mattered, especially since the came at a time where the Trump presidency was happening. We were seeing an expansion of the global gag rule, said that if organizations give money and support promotion or services toward abortion, then they would lose USAID funding. And so we were seeing a growth in oppositional actors, that we call anti-gender and anti-rights actors, that were mobilizing, getting stronger, well-resourced. And so the FIAP came at a time where it positioned Canada to be able to fill some of those gaps and speak out for these rights, which we saw with the She Decides campaign. That was a response to the global gag rule. And for us specifically, before the FIAP, Action Canada had never received a Global Affairs Canada grant. So the funding that we were able to channel to our partners for SRHR services, comprehensive sexuality education and advocacy, was a major shift. And it was rare before then to see such a focus on these areas and to be funded for that focus, and to actually be able to promote a gender transformative approach instead of women's empowerment, not being linked to the structural of realizing their rights. So I think now the task is probably to preserve some of the elements, which we see as something that transforms the FIAP and Global Affairs Canada interacting with CSOs, and its ability to examine and transform the power structures that inhibit gender equality in its implementation. So like holding true to that and continuing
Rita, and then Sheila. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to the organizers for putting this on. So Brianna took everything I was gonna say bit better, but I'm gonna try and bring a slight nuance to that perhaps. So just for some historical context, you know, we alluded to this earlier, but this policy emerged, so the FIAP emerged from years of extremely oppressive harbor government. Don't talk of feminism. Gender equality wasn't used. Women were seen as entrepreneurs. Canadian aid was banned from funding abortions. Brianna alluded to that. And, you know, and for a minute, until the policy was reversed or until the rhetoric was reversed, it was banned from funding contraception. Unbelievable. It was really hard to engage with the Harper government. They rarely spoke to civil society. And when they did, it could be very combative. Partnership branch, which was a little programming branch within Global Affairs Canada or CETA. So that partnership branch, as we know, it was dismantled. Those programs were dismantled, which was really emblematic of the approach of the Harper government. So we went from that to a government that took a year to consult more than 15,000 people in 65 countries and emerged with Feminist International Assistance. The document that not only centered the agency of women and girls, but did so through an explicit feminist approach perspective, talked about, as Eileen said, shifting power. So it was remarkable, that shift. And it was such a contrast to the previous 10 years, you know. In terms of implementation, yeah, it took a while to turn that ship around for sure. And it wasn't perfect. So I think it makes sense to mention that, you know, there were 6 areas of action, as they called it. So gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, human dignity, growth that works for everyone, environment and climate action, inclusive governance, and peace and security. So the policy reflected the Liberal government's inclinations, which were socially progressive, but neoliberal. So action area number 3 relating to growth. So growth that works for everyone. Can growth work for everyone? So the emphasis really was on the, you know, private sector financing, blended finance, and there's a lot of sort of critique of that to this day. A feminist approach might have seen that action area actually be about economic justice or tackling economic inequality. So there's a different, you know, one woman might have seen a different shift. All of that being said, you know, I agree with both Eileen and Brianna. I mean, there's no doubt that there was an impact. And in terms of my own organization, so there was more resourcing with taxpayer funds of feminist organizations and feminist initiatives. And it was about quantity, but it's also about quality. So as Brianna mentioned, scaling up of work on initiatives that included things like sexual and reproductive health and rights, including comprehensive sexuality education, advocacy, scaling up work on, you know, direct work that directly linked to climate change, such as agroecology, women-led agroecology, support for LGBTQ plus organizations, which, you know, today has taken on sort of a heightened impact given the environment. So that's 1. 2, I think public engagement work as well. So work that we did on social justice issues with Canadians, engaging Canadians using, you know, a variety of methods was also heightened through the FIAP. As an example, you know, a year ago, we took a group of feminist activists, young feminist activists from the global south to the east coast. So for example, in Fredericton and Moncton, spoke to folks who, you know, worked on abortion access, which was also an issue in New Brunswick a year ago. So there was this sense of working on similar issues, being able to relate to each other. There were peer-to-peer learning events as well as sort of public engagement events with activists. So this kind of work lends itself to Canadians understanding the world better, seeing themselves as global citizens, and being in solidarity with struggles around the world. So really trying to get away from that charity model. I think three, the FIAP really lent itself to being able to influence Canadian policy. So we had access, civil society had access to the bureaucracy, to the ministers, to ministers' staff in a way that we never did. It was unprecedented. And I think that, you know, it led to significant policy influence, and Brianna just mentioned your commitment. And I think lastly, the FIAP was like, it was almost a portal that allowed us to have other conversations. So when we were talking about the use of a feminist approach, localization was a word that sort of emerged, a concept that emerged from that. Aid as a colonial construct, you know, discussions around feminist foreign policy, what that means. So these are just some ideas, I think, some ways in which, yeah, lent itself to other, you know, other conversation.
Now, would you want to add on?
Gosh, it's hard to follow these two, but I'll just add a few additional bits, but focus more on broadly the impact that might have had on society organizations and Canadian engagement in that space. We'd initially in our postdoc and with Rebecca and with the Women's Rights Policy Group, we did an initial study in 2019 to see how civil society organizations perceived and engaged with the FIAP at the time. In those early years, there was these initial investments without additional funding from Global Affairs Canada to strengthen the organizational capacity for civil society and for development organizations to engage with the FIAP. So there was an increase in gender equality policies that weren't there previously. There was an increase in staffing of gender equality specialists, and also at the managerial levels and not quite just as technical specialists. There was an increase in trainings and capacity development around program development, M&E, research around gender equality analysis. There was limitations around, we did find that there was limitations around leadership. So how do civil society organizations engage with feminist work and feminist practice from the expectations of the FIAP with ongoing and similar kind of structures of organizations that still remain hierarchical, different sort of leadership mechanisms that don't really coincide with feminist work. So unequal or harmful power dynamics, kind of collaborate across different levels of management and things like that. From the programmatic perspective, there was an additional emphasis on M&E, feminist M&E, and how to implement that kind of work across and for Global Affairs Canada's reporting mechanisms. There was a lot of bridging between sectors. So, for example, climate change and environment was one of the key priorities, and there was an increase in funding to really deal with and gender equality in that space. There was, as Brianna and Rita both mentioned, organizations that weren't necessarily engaged with gender equality in their mandate or in their priorities really invested more in that space. And feminist organizations were really able to deepen their engagement and become sort of leaders and thought leaders in feminist practice. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about partner organization perspective. So we all work with organizations in the Global South, and that's often a major question. What is the impact? Like, what do they think, or what are their perceptions of the FIAP, and does it even matter? But the funding itself, you know, lends itself to these collaborative partnerships that weren't necessarily in existence before. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of women's rights organizations working in other sectors that maybe they haven't necessarily been prioritizing. So agroecology organizations or food justice. We're seeing, and they're working together through these partnerships that GAC has supported. We've also looking at organizations are investing more in data collection around gender equality objectives, which hasn't previously been made available or supported in the past, and especially in organizations that don't necessarily have the resources to do that. So creating programs such as Women's Voices Leadership and other kind of mechanisms within FIAP to allow these partnerships, create more data and understanding of the impact. In terms of like what was feminist, what was the feminist aspect of FIAP and the impact, there's a varying degree of perceptions of that, as Eileen had mentioned. We oscillate between recognizing the idea of a feminist policy being relevant to movement building and building solidarity across movements, but at the same time, it also recognizes that, you know, FIAP is one particular aspect of, or one particular form of feminism that doesn't necessarily speak to more context specific feminist work in particular areas. And because of that, does it matter if it's a feminist policy in certain contexts? There is more comfort in looking at more gender transformative. So what are the differences between a gender transformative approach and feminist work? And so those are a lot of conversations we're having at the moment. I'll leave it there.
We'll just stay in the room then, and Rita, if you can take this question. What are your thoughts on how a feminist approach has guided programs organizations before the FIAP?
So yeah, thanks for that question. Maybe one of the things that I forgot to mention earlier, I'll just tack it on, is there was a lot of talk throughout the FIAP about sort of the process, like processes being feminist. And so there's a lot of work being done, committees and task forces and et cetera, about streamlining the approach of government around aid. So, you know, whether it's around reporting or whether it's around proposals or whether it's around the financial management aspect. There was a lot of work that was done on that. I think this is one of the areas where, unfortunately, the FIAP under-delivered, over-promised and under-delivered. Because I'm not sure that, in general, there were some wins, but I think in general, it's not any easier, and it might even be harder to deliver as civil society organizations, and particularly from the perspective of organizations in the Global South, to deliver Canadian aid than it's ever been. So I just wanted to get that in. I think a lot of organizations had different approaches pre-FIAP. I mean, I can only talk about our approach. So Inter Pares is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So that's my organization. We were founded in 1975 on sort of the principle of solidarity, of working with local activist organizations in the South. And it was in the mid-80s that we explicitly became a feminist organization. Had our own little revolution. A number of different sort of principles emerged from that. I mean, one was continuing to work in collaboration with organizations in the Global South in solidarity, certainly supporting women, supporting gender equality, resourcing these organizations, but also looking at feminist analysis and bringing feminist analysis to the work. Certainly coalition work and collaboration work with organizations here in Canada is an important feminist tenet. And at Inter Pares, we decided in the mid-80s to convert the organizational model to one which we call co-management or a collaborative model, which it's really a flat structure and it's a defining feature where we all make the same base salary and major decisions by consensus. I mean, these are some of the ways in which we operationalized our own sort of principles of feminism. In 2011, we have, still on our website, we did an IDRC funded sort of self-study where we looked at, it's a publication called Does It Work? And it really was around our feminist model and, you know, does it work? So that's still available on our website. But I mean, what FIAP helped sort of help generate was the ability for us to talk about these things more openly and to push aspirational or ambitious policy asks. It allowed us to collaborate, you know, with organizations with whom we like had more common cause to push those policy agendas, you know, and for I think a lot of people, a lot of organizations, all organizations in the sector, you know, it sort of supported us in either reckoning or reflecting, depending on your point of view, on our relationship to feminism and defining it in very particular ways. You know, so for what, yeah, for some people it was, or for some organizations, perhaps it was performative. For others, it was really a genuine evolution. And still for others, it was like a coming out party. So the whole range.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add on, Sheila or Brianna? Otherwise, we'll just turn it over to Rebecca if she has any questions.
Did you want to add? Yeah. But there's more questions.
Okay, actually, we just submission.
All right, I am not sure if Eileen can hear us, but we wanted to hear from Eileen. If you could share with us, Eileen, what value you see in the FIAP for the sector more broadly. And if there's anything else that you wanted to add to what you've heard on the panel so far.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, I'm sorry that we're not able to hear Shaheen because I know she was eager to
So I can you hear me now?
Yeah, well, so let us hear from Shaheen first, Rebecca, and then I can come in.
Shaheen,
Okay.
welcome, and we're so glad that you're here. Please share with us a little bit your thoughts on how the FIAP has been important for the sector more broadly and some of the work that you've been doing and how it resonates with national policies as well in Bangladesh.
Thank you so much. Apologies for this bad connection and apologies for coming in late. Actually, we have quite a story to tell from Bangladesh, I must say. Since the last 6 years, with funding support from Global Affairs Canada through the FIAP, we have been implementing the Women Voice Leadership Project. It was a 5-year project, and now we don't call it the next phase, we call it the Renewed Women and Leadership, Women Voice Leadership Project. What the policy has enabled us to do is to work with very, very grassroots level women's rights organization, build their capacity, build their leadership, and really bring about transformative changes, not only in their lives, not only in the way they work, but the community that they work with. These small organizations are underfunded, as women's rights organizations are underfunded all over the world, but especially these very, very grassroots level organizations. And we have been like in the middle between the donors and these small organizations. And the changes I have seen in them in the last 5 years in these organizations and the women and who lead them has been absolutely phenomenal. And I can give you a number of organizations, a number of examples. We have been working with 16 such organizations, and 11 of them are from the most marginalized, socially excluded groups. For example, women with disabilities, transgenders, sex workers, migrant returnee, women who have been, and so these 16 organizations through the FIAP, because we have used the feminist approach in working with them, they have, their transformation. Just to give you one example, 5 of them got elected to local bodies through direct election. They went out, seeking votes, and they got elected. We used in everything, we used the human rights approach. And Manusher Janno Foundation, the organization that I work with, that I lead, we always had a human rights approach, but we did not call it a feminist organization. So working exclusively with women's organizations, led by women, governed by women, has been a totally different kind of experience for us. I would say that uh, besides their leadership quality, their ability to negotiate, their ability to bargain, this particular project has also helped with their economic empowerment. And we have used different approaches where women have received extensive training in enterprise development, in management, in being able to access credit, and most of them have been able to start some kind of enterprise. So for us and for my organization, this particular project has brought in a whole lot of changes, and which is because of the FIAP. So if you have any particular question, I would be very, very happy to answer that. But I would say that the transformation, one example, uh, I would like, as I said, 4 women from the untouchable community, disabled persons with disability, ethnic minority, they have been able to get elected to local bodies. So that is one of the leadership transformative changes that we saw. And they have been able to address systemic barriers, like or change social norms and customs, like reducing child marriage in their area of work, reducing or addressing issues of violence, gender-based violence, seeking justice for women. Just small examples, but lovely examples. I have that one woman told me that, do you know, when now I walk into an office of a government official, he stands up when he sees me. These are these, lovely quotes I get from these women, and I've seen their journey in the last 5 years. And I would say that this program definitely needs to be expanded, at least in Bangladesh, where these women's rights organizations are underfunded, and they're, completely neglected. So this FIAP gave us the opportunity to work with a very, very special, particular kind of organizations. And it has been a learning for our organizations too. Our work in the last 22 years, we focus very much on women's empowerment, but this was entirely different. To go in there, to seek, to find out, and use flexible funding. These organizations just cannot compete with the mid-level or bigger organization because of the donors' requirement of due diligence. So we held their hand, we build their capacity, and now they are capable enough of accessing other funding. and expanding their organizations. So I'll stop now for the moment. If you have any further questions, I would be happy to answer you.
Thank you so much. It's so great that we can hear from you. I want to turn back to you, Eileen, just because I know you were going to share some thoughts, but then we want to turn to some of the critiques. So over to you, Eileen.
Thanks, and maybe I can bridge into the critiques since you want to move that way. Let me build on what I heard in the room and what I started with earlier to talk about the value more broadly in the sector. And I do want to connect with something that Rita said around engaging Canadians. One of the things that I think that the FIAP has been able to do, and actually feminist policy more broadly under the previous Liberal government, is really help us connect and meaningfully the local and the global. And to me, that's a major preoccupation. And it also connects with, in a timely way with the SDGs, or what we're supposed to be working towards with the SDGs. And that is to say that, there's a common narrative with different context that can help to bridge what we aim to see in parts of the developing world, but what we're also responsible for doing here at home. And so really good examples of feminist advocacy, of feminist ways of knowing and doing are right here in Canada, and can be drawn upon. And I think about some of the women's resource centers that I've come to know and appreciate and work with here in Nova Scotia. But equally important is the knowledge that the women are bringing from around the world back to Canada as well. And again, the recognition that knowledge goes both ways, and that the knowledge and the experiences, the very real and lived experiences that women in particular have around the world, can often lead to some very innovative ideas right here. And as we look at migration and new people coming all the time to this country, they themselves are also bringing those ideas, and I'm very grateful for that diversity that we are able to really collaborate with, and so that's an important piece to me. The second is around, again, I think this was Rita talking about moving away from the charity model, and I also emphasized earlier that our work is around community-led, citizen-led, community-driven, and asset-based. But one thing that I'll add to that is that what I have found in the last several years, and in particular in my role right now, is that it's also required an education of other donors. So Global Affairs Canada, as a federal department, can bring that as a mandate, but it has also meant that, that's only a fraction of the funding that my organization gets. So how do I ensure that I'm bringing other funders along as well, in terms of understanding the importance of a feminist practice and set of principles in the ways that we work. Secondly, I'll just talk a little bit again to localization. Because I'm sitting in the middle of a university, and I'm quasi-autonomous, so I feel at times like I'm an NGO in the middle of an academic and very patriarchal, hierarchical space. For me, education here is paramount. And so when I look at the work we do, education has been front and center, and it's often been about us providing very practical, skill-based programs that connect theory and praxis for practitioners and leaders around the world. However, it's what the FIAP has allowed me to start doing is imagining a flipping of that, which connects to a localization strategy of our own, which is how do I shift organizations and women on the ground in particular to be the leader educators, for their knowledge and ways of knowing and doing to be front and center as part of the teaching and the curriculum development. And that for me is part of an express goal for the next 5 years. Connected to that, though, is something that I'll reflect on a little bit, which is the contextual challenges. And I think Sheila mentioned that, you know, and there's a comfort level that, or, you know, organizations that we work with partners, that they have around, you know, fully addressing what, you know, this nuance of feminism or this idea of feminism, with, you know, with good reason. So that navigating of the space for them from a contextual perspective and the nuances, and Shaheen, you're in the perfect place where this is visible. You're in the middle of a very tumultuous time in Bangladesh. Nepal is following suit. All of South Asia could go that direction. I mean, how do you navigate a feminist set of principles and practices at a time when there's so many other variables that need to be considered? So thinking a little bit about the reality of the contextual challenges and making sure that our imposition of feminism doesn't become yet again another colonizing sort of response or insistence, if you will, on partners, even as they're trying to negotiate the space. Finally, I'll just say that I'm starting to also see, and this is where there's tensions, I think, with FIAP. There is a collision, if I can call it that, within some women-led within some spaces, between women-led organizations that might have an economic empowerment mandate or preference. I'm not doing justice to it, and have done that successfully for decades. You know, working with informal women workers in, you know, thousands, if not more. And then, you know, the feminist autonomous movements that we see and the push that they have around advocacy. And I think that if, you know, as we look at working with women-led organizations or women's rights focused organizations, we have to remember that there's a heterogeneity to that, that is also really important to unpack. And coming from outside, particularly in spaces like Bangladesh or other countries, you know, wherever they may be, we need to be mindful of our outsider status, as we're watching how that's being negotiated, and those perceptions of the validity of organizations in, you know, occupying those spaces or speaking on behalf of. And like I said, I have experiences with this, and, you know, one of the examples is around, let's say, SGBV, sexual gender-based violence, where I've seen one organization, you know, be very, very careful, and they're informed by their comfort level with risk, especially when government is concerned, their own, you know, governments, local and national. You know, on the one hand, SGBV being packaged as economic violence rather than really addressing, you know, physical safety, psychological well-being. And it's a real reluctance to move too far into the private space as well, and also connected in the public. So these are the realities, which brings me back to a very final point, which is around whose feminism and whose responsibility. And Rita, you mentioned some of the work that you've done as an organization to really address and unpack and think about what that means for you, not just to talk a talk, but to walk a walk. And, you know, we're all in different places and able in order to, you know, with our ability to do that fully. But, you know, when it comes to criticism of the FIAP, for me, a lot of it comes down to operational, and the FIAP and the intent of the FIAP hasn't always been matched by the actions of Global Affairs Canada in terms of the way in which it's rolled out various things. Kudos for some of the longevity that it's given for things like women's voice and leadership and others. But then there's systems and structures and processes that continuously hold us back. And our partners, the local organizations, hold them back from being fully able to achieve what it set out to achieve. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much.
Thanks. We have just 5 more minutes for our panel, so I'm just going to combine the last couple of key questions here, in part because I look around the room and I see, and I can assign each of you to the critiques that I've heard in your scholarly writing and your critical reflections. There are some important critiques that have emerged, and I'm wondering, what value did you see in these critiques for helping advance Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy? And also, we'll give each of you maybe like a minute on the panel to reflect on that. So what value was there in the critiques? And these critiques range from neoliberalism, instrumentalizing, essentializing women, the failure to define what means to be feminist, or the lack of intersectionality, limited attention to LGBTQ+, and many other issues and critiques also that Eileen has mentioned. So what value, if any, was there in those critiques? And some of you reach this space as scholars and practitioners. And is the FIAP worth fighting for? And if so, why? So let's start with you, Brianna.
Well, if I'm gonna do a minute here, but I'll try. I think the critique of the FIAP's loose definition of feminism means that there was a lack of institutionalization of gender transformative approaches. And what that meant is that when the tides were shifting and we didn't quite know what was going to happen with the election, there were some organizations that might have changed the way that they were framing issues in anticipation for a certain government, which is really hard because what we want to show is that our issues, our priorities are not partisan.
Yeah.
They expand across, so when there is a shift in it, that shows that we can be easily swayed, and we have to be very brave in this moment, and continue to show that. And I think also what it showed us was that though there is lip service being paid, there has to be alignment between things. So like, we have to make sure that the government is accountable to the FIAP with the ODA Accountability Act, for instance, and avoiding political backsliding, because the vigilance we need is clear. Last week, former Minister of International Development, Hussein, introduced a motion that would reframe international assistance to explicitly serve Canada's economic interests. It proposes creating a new funding window that ties poverty reduction initiative abroad to opportunities for Canadian industries, and requires reporting on those economic benefits of those projects and how they benefit economically in Canada. So we have to be very vigilant on that. But one of the other things is and I'm sure you're going to touch on this a little bit, the critique of intersectionality and LGBTQI+ issues in the framework, completely warranted. However, there were strong advocacy efforts that pushed that needle beyond what's beyond, and there needs to be a consideration of, there is a consideration of this, of the funding initiative. So the work that the Future Planning Initiative did and Dignity Network Canada, for instance, really helped push for a dedicated Dignity Network, specifically LGBTQ2I International Assistance Program, to fill some of those gaps. I'm just gonna say one last thing because I think it's really important. I think one of the critiques that is really important is a lack of policy coherence between the FIAP and other Canadian foreign policies, be it macroeconomics, trade, migration, or at institutions like the IMF. They're failing. They have been failing when the FIAP was a strong priority to connect how these issues, when not, when there's impacts with the choices they make policy-wise, undermine gender equality, SRHR, and health systems. So we can't dismantle structural barriers as a government, as advocates, as academics, as CSOs, without dismantling structural barriers or making meaningful progress on gender equality, which means actually Canada signing the Global Tax Treaty and there being debt cancellations, especially when global South countries are losing hundreds of billions of dollars annually on corporate tax avoidance, and they're repaying more in debt than they are receiving in grants and loans, money that could potentially be used toward health systems, education, gender. And so, is it worth saving? Yes. Answer yes, because I think it's a good accountability tool. And we shouldn't just throw it away, but we should use it as a motivation to strengthen it, not abandon it. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Maybe others will add to that. Sheila, over to you.
Yeah, just a build on what Brianna was talking about in terms of the critiques, and the one of the main critiques that we explored was the intersectional considerations and just the very narrowly defined aspects of what intersectionality entailed and from a feminist perspective, and how do you operationalize that? And as Brianna said, yes, the two critiques were that there was very limited mention of LGBTQI support. And as a result, in 2019, the initial commitment of $30 million over 5 years initiated ACTIF and other funds to support those kinds of organizations. And then from 2020 to 2025, that funding has been now reduced to 10 million per year on work for rights in ODI recipient countries. At the same time, and it's shown globally that it's like the third largest donor government for LGBTQI movements. Yet we can see the political polarization creates further marginalization of the violation of the rights of their community members. And so it's needed more than ever. So the reduction in funding over time is concerning. And so that's something to kind of think about as we look to the future of FIAP. Secondly, the FIAP didn't mention anything about disability rights, yet in 2021 and 2019, sorry, in 20, sorry, I missed the, but there was a disability inclusion focus added to the funding in global affairs. Yet the funding is still marginal. It's only 0.3% of ODA, even though the number of persons with disabilities are expected to increase through the rise of humanitarian crisis, through conflicts, natural disasters, ongoing insecurity from the higher cost of living and changing farming and food landscapes and climate uncertainties. So again, two areas where, because the intersectional components of FIAP weren't necessarily clearly defined, it's shifting into less impact or less support in those areas now. Is it worth fighting for? Absolutely. But I'm a bit of an optimist, given the fact that FIAP evolved after decades of work from civil society organizations, from advocates of gender equality, from people working within GAC and CEDA to support gender equality work over decades of work. And so it's emerged after a lot of initial building of a foundation of that kind of work. So FIAP, yes, it was remarkable, and it made a significant impact across the international cooperation in Canada, but also globally. But it's also a significant example of feminist policy more broadly. So there was discussion of the feminist foreign policy in 2020, 2021. But connecting with what Brianna was talking about in these domestic policies, how can we think of FIAP as an example of feminist policy formation and implementation more broadly, both domestically and globally, as a way to kind of bridge it forward and think about it in the future?
So yeah, I totally agree.
Can I make a very short intervention here?
Yeah,
May
go
I?
ahead.
Yes. No, I just, what Eileen said about, connecting the local with the global, I think that's a very, very important point. But in the context of Bangladesh, I just want to make the group aware that supporting these small grassroots level organization and embracing the intersectionality that we have been able to through this project, it's like more important now more than ever, because we see in Bangladesh resurgence of a rightist group, which is very, very deliberately trying to undermine women's rights. So for us who have been working on women's rights for a couple of decades, we see that there is a fear of going back. So I see FIAP as something which is so, embracing of intersectionality and the transformation, the transformative impact it can have on women's and women's organization. I see it really, really critical at this stage of our work where, or the operating environment where we are. I'll just a minute on its success. Actually, it is a concept, and the success depends on the way it is contextualized and rolled out in different, places and different contexts. For us, it has been really quite a experience, that being a feminist for many decades, I have learned so much. I just wanted to bring that perspective.
Great points, Shaheen. Thank you so much. Rita, and then we'll take questions.
So, I mean, to your point about the critiques around the FIAP, I think they're absolutely essential. Because I think without those critiques, we wouldn't have been able to reach the ambition of the policy goals that able to make it, what it was when it was implemented. So, that's one thing. I think the second thing around, is it worth fighting for? Like, hell yeah. But, it's both aspirational and inspirational, but I think we need to be savvy about the way we do it. We're living in a different world, and so we need to speak to those factors that are on everyone's minds, especially domestically. We see increasing militarization. We see an emphasis on domestic economic issues. We can't, I think, advocate for a policy without looking at the context in which we're advocating it and making it relevant. So that's what I say.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think like something Rita was talking about, like the access that feminist organizations had to the government was really important. And in talking about they were operating in different times, like with Justin Trudeau, yes, there were critiques of the FIAP, but there was a genuine interest from that government to engage with feminist organizations. And actually I think it was the last meeting Justin Trudeau had in office was with feminist organizations. And so they were able to move that needle a little bit easier when you have somebody that, sees your work as valuable. And so, yeah, we have all of these amazing data collection and impact, and we need to be able to now demonstrate that, one, to the Canadian public, two, to the new government, and show that like gender equality in SRHR isn't just suave, like, oh, we can just do it if we want to do it, and LGBTQ rights. No, like it's actually fundamental to transforming the structural.
All right, we'll have the panelists say one final word towards the end of our event, but let's hear from you. What are your questions? I'll take 4 or 5 questions, and then we'll have the panelists have a chance to respond. One of the things that I'm thinking about, and feel free to raise your hand, I'll acknowledge you, is the way that there's a slippage into past tense that I'm hearing when we talk about the FIAP. The FIAP was, the FIAP still is. It's maybe this to comment on as you wrap up your discussion points is, what are we looking at today? What does the FIAP really look like right now? And what do we need to be fighting for to get to where we want to be in terms of moving that needle? All right, so some questions from the audience, please. Yeah, so I'll start with Tess.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing talk. Yeah, so funnily enough, my question was very much related to what you just said. One of the questions that was asked earlier is FIAP worth fighting for? And I'm glad that the answer is sounding yes. But then the next question is, how can we fight for FIAP in a changing political environment? Especially now we're seeing a shift in priorities. There's budget cuts for international development projects, more money spent for this. There's also a cultural shift with the rise in populism, nationalism, and these ideologies tend to be in conflict with feminism and also with international development in general. So the question is, how do you see the future of FIAP within that climate? And also, how can we like weather the storm, so to speak? What are the best strategies that we might have to ensure that we don't lose the progress that has been made over the past years?
Another session.
It's a great question, though, the how piece. So maybe we can reflect on that a little bit, building on the successes that they've talked about already too, in terms of the solidarity and so on. But yes, please.
Let me begin by saying I'm too old to fight for anything. No policy in the world implemented 100% on the ground. That gap fundamentally remains, and it remains a lot in development. FIAP, yes, I do agree, and I do agree. Main problem with FIAP was that it did not spell out as much as an operational document, which it should have, bearing the experiences that CEDA all along had in the area of gender. So I do agree to that. I have a question. In 2014, Sweden was the first country to implement this Feminist International Assistance Policy. In 2022, Sweden gave it up. Question is, why? Was it political, or was it that the Swedes found it almost impossible to do it? So I think it is good for us in Canada to ask that question, because we followed the Swedes. They went first, we came second, came France and Mexico after that. So I think it is good if we could look at it and see why that happened. But it was very interesting to hear the panel, because you brought the ground reality back. Also,
I think we have some questions online, so we'll take one of the questions from online, not the.
So from Noor Mirza, how can FIAP or post-FIAP, a world that's post-FIAP, redefine the parameters of women and girls so as not to limit its scope? How does public policy engage with the anti-feminist backlash, including the reneging of women and females' rights and trans rights? Could the panelists also comment on how the parameters of femininity are shrinking rapidly? One has to look over female to be called female, i.e. the controversies over that boxer in the Olympics, or Brigitte McNeil's, or fight with Candace Owens. That's from Noor Mirza.
I think it's up here too. We maybe back up if people want to have a quick look. And last question to Margaret, did you have a question?
Yeah, just building on everyone's points, I think this point about being savvy and strategic given the backlash is something I think we'll deal with and think about. So, just to play devil's advocate, how do we move forward when you work with groups? Some of them have jobs. That's their trigger word. They feel funding, they lose and they start fighting over semantics. So some, including Sweden, including Monash University, have dropped some of these words. But I just want to separate dropping the words and keeping the work. So our energy is all framed, right? So I just would love you to comment on, because some local grassroots are still doing the work, but they're very strategic, savvy, and they've always chosen words. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's start with our folks online. We'll start with you, Eileen, and then we'll come to Shaheen. Go ahead, Eileen.
Gosh, I'm still trying to formulate my thoughts around this. But there's many of you in the room that I've worked with over the last several decades. And we've been here before in terms of the ebbs and flows of, just maybe not of the FIAP so much as just gender equality, programming around women's rights and active citizenship is something that was, that just came out, because of FIAP, and feminist principles didn't come out just because of FIAP. It's the waves of feminism have shown that we've had this fight many times before. And I think it's important that we go back and we reflect on some of the strategies that were used in order to keep to keep us moving forward rather than backwards, particularly in this era. And I think that, from a very practical standpoint, I don't know what the government is going to do next in terms of the FIAP itself. But I do know that the government will look at what its priorities are of the day. So the question is, how best can we ensure that the FIAP is addressing that? And some of that's there already. Growth that works for everyone, climate. Those are pieces that are gonna, I would imagine pretty strongly are going to be on the agenda. Do we have is there something in the way of a focus on trade that the FIAP is also looking at? Can we take the FIAP and its focus on international assistance and look more closely at feminist policy, foreign policy more broadly, and see how those intersections might emerge? So those are the practical sort of things that I'm not sure that it's are not already obvious to most. I think that also there's a responsibility for us as organizations, and I'm seeing online that people are encouraging us to do the writing, to reflect on especially the positives of the FIAP. It's not without its problems and its flaws, but it's a heck of a lot better than what we had to work with before. So how do we encourage that? But also, if we're truly thinking from a localization point of view, how are we ensuring that it's the partners on the ground that we're working with that are also continuously pushing and saying, this is a priority for us? Not just the women-led organizations, the women's rights organizations, but well beyond that. Because if they see, if Global Affairs Canada and other interested parties see that this continues to be a priority for development, and for growth in the organizations we work with, then it's going to be easier to make the case. And then finally, I would say that the FIAP doesn't have to live just at Global Affairs Canada. And yes, the resources mean a lot, the financial resources mean a lot. But we can also ensure that in our respective organizations that we are keeping it live and front and center, and not letting it dissipate with the newest sort of areas of focus of the day. So I'm not sure if that's answering questions. I'm concerned about the direction that most, not just Canada, but lots of other countries that have been like-minded allies have been going. And I think about the Netherlands, for example, and the massive cuts to programs that have been very much aligned with what we've been trying to do. So is Canada willing to be a lone voice in a space where other countries, other bilaterals might move in a different direction? I think time will tell. The UN this week reaffirmed a commitment and an imperative around gender equality. It doesn't speak necessarily to feminism per se, but I think that Canada still has the potential to be a very distinctive leader and hold true if it wants to. Mindful that our government right now is still a minority government, and it's shifting. It is shifting priorities to things that matter a lot to Canadians. And I think there's another piece of work, is to keep the public sort of, well engaged in what we're doing and why we think it's important.
Eileen, Shaheen, over to you.
Should I speak now?
Please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Eileen, for that. Our context is so different, where women face so many challenges, economic, social, cultural, political, and to put FIAP in that context and to contextualize it and always being aware of the challenges and what is working and what is not working and why it works and why it doesn't work is something that we grapple with all the time. For me, the transformation that I have seen within organizations because of the work we have done with them, it has really helped us to look at this whole women's empowerment and growth in a very different way. The focus has to be continuously on women because of the challenges, the different challenges they face. For example, in the climate vulnerable areas, the challenges are of a certain kind. Then the intersectionalities that through FIAP, we have been able to embrace. There, the challenges are so different, each one of them. So what it has done for us is we are also quite successfully advocating for policy change within the government. And I just want to update you that through our work, we have been working on unpaid care work for a long time. And now we have reached a place where government is really looking at these policies, like, for example, gender budgeting, or providing more support, infrastructural policy support to women's, organizations. So it's not only us; it has had quite a multiple impact within the community, but also within the government thinking. And I think that policy advocacy is extremely important. And for me, my future work would be to influence other bilateral donors in Bangladesh to also think about it in this way. And as you said, I really think Canada could definitely be a leader, the government, in this whole feminist approach and FIAP. Within the bilateral donors, most of them are going towards growth, investments, working with business, which is fine, which is also very, very important. But the emphasis has shifted from the feminist approach and the focus on gender equality and making that a priority. And I think through the work that we are doing with Women Voice in Leadership, we can keep on pushing for that. So, that's my take. Thank you.
All right, back in the room here. Rita, do you want to go next?
Sure. Well, I hope this isn't a wake for the FIAP. It may well be, but nevertheless, I think one of the most important lessons from the Harper era was, if we want to be strategic and savvy as a sector, then we can't let policies divide us. We have to be working in solidarity with each other. And like, it's hard to know what we have some indications, but it's hard to know what the tea leaves kind of say. But I mean, if you want to look at the positive side, I mean, the last election was partially won on differentiating Canada from the US and US policies. It was partially won on, so does this translate into maintaining funding, aid funding, or maintaining funding for SRHR, or maintaining funding for LGBTQ rights? Who knows? Let's hope so. I think we better need to understand where sort of the government is going in terms of that balance of hard power and soft power. So once again, it's something that we need to keep an eye on. And lastly, I mean, there are times of abundance and there are times of scarcity. And in times of scarcity, sometimes, existence is resistance. So whether it's grassroots feminist organizations in the Global South, or organizations in Canada that work on international feminist social justice issues, we just have to, there may be a time where we just have to focus on surviving until things get better.
Yeah, thanks, but I completely agree. But part of me wishes that we had somebody we disagreed with. Generate a little bit more tension there, but yeah, I take your point in working strategically and working at multiple tracks. So yes, let's keep feminist movement building and feminist work alive and working in the spaces that we're able to do so. But let's also consider working, continuing the work, but reframing it in terms, and to align with. So we're using different terms as gender transformative work or other aspects of gender equality without closing off conversations because of our and then let's do that. And let's bring in the value of alliance building and movement building across LGBTQI and across disability rights. Yes, those were the weaknesses of FIAP, but those weaknesses are still, we're still third, Canada's still third funder in the world for disability rights. We're still 7th for LGBTQI. So, sorry, I'm probably getting my ratings like Ron, but we're still very much valued in that space, even though those are the weaknesses. And so as Canada, you know, comes out and we're looking at budgeting and looking at funding, gender equality work is still very much our strength. In that space, still have much to offer in terms of our identity as Canada first, or in terms of what we're keep going, but be diversify and use these multiple tracks and maintain these alliances.
Yeah, I think we have to show that we can have these silence that coming together, but that those levers look a little bit different. So maybe we're not taking it, but maybe there is something that still pushed those political levers so that we're able to progress our work and not create more division. So one of the examples that comes to mind is during CIPS on status of women at the UN this year, was when Carney released his wartime cabinet, and we realized there was no minister for women and gender equality. Well, during that UN event, there were organizations that came together at the UN to write a statement on this and got hundreds of signatures on it. And when there was the actual announcement of the cabinet, the Minister of Women and Gender Equality was there. Not saying that there is a direct connection, but that lever does matter in the way that, you know, showing that there is support. And I think when we're coming together in coalitions, remembering that we actually do not have to agree on everything. And when we put that as a framework for who we are going to be in coalition with, then it's just us. So finding people who, yes, have those same strong values, but might differ a little bit in their approaches is how we move forward. Another good example is the Feminist Influencing Group, which is organizations in Canada came together before the election to do a Demand Better campaign. This campaign was to rally the Canadian public around realizing that there isn't a false dichotomy between a strong economy and rights, and that actually having strong protections for human rights helps an economy, helps build strong, resilient communities. And so allowing people to buy in, and also realizing that we have different audiences. So when you read a statement that comes out from an organization and you're like, actually, why didn't they use so-and-so word? These organizations, we also have autonomy. There's a reason why we're maybe not using women and girls in all their diversity at the UN right now, at a time where there is the Geneva Declaration consensus and growing polarization around the term diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's a reason why there's a reframing of some of those without losing our core principles, without abandoning those, but realizing that, yeah, there's got to be a new way of working, because the new way of working, unfortunately, isn't good for it.
Like any great conversation, we're reflecting back on things that we've talked about in previous events and different work that we've done. There have been a whole series of events. Stephen Brani's organized some really great ones with folks that were here in the room around feminist international assistance policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a great event. And Lily Nichols has a wonderful report on the CIPS website. It's worth examining. Beth Borniak, who has written a really great blog on financing for development in the feminist space. These are all part of the conversation, and it leads us into the future where we have other really key events that are coming up. REC event on October 2nd. On October 10th, there's an event, Group of 78 and IDRC co-organizing an event called Redefining Development in the New World Disorder. Rereading the State from Below in Context of Conflict and Fragility that Stephen Brani's organizing on October 20th. All of these events, most of these events you can find on the CIPS events webpage, CIPS, and more to come after that.